Ja. Oavsett. Tack.
So it's 1:15, and we're back after the lunch break. And so most of you were here this morning, but those of you who are new this afternoon, welcome to Challenge Lab. And today we're going to have this afternoon we're going to have the two last presentations of today, and tomorrow there are 3 more presentations. And that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to leave the word to Ville and Nickhil, who will be presenting their thesis. We've got 25 to 30 minutes to present. I'll let you know when 25 minutes have passed. And then we will have 10 minutes of opposition. And after the opposition, we will have 15 minutes of questions from the audience. Right, so welcome. There we go. You got this.
This one's you right away.
Thank you.
Alrighty. Welcome to this Challenge Lab 2018 thesis presentations afternoon session, also from our behalf. My name is Ville, and I'm here with my thesis partner Nickhil today.
Hey.
And yeah, we would like to start with a little show of hands. Like, would you raise your hand if you think that there are misalignments in the transportation system? Okay, there are some hands. And what about raise your hand if you think that these misalignments are hindering the transition process that we have spoken earlier already today about the transitions? Yeah, thank you. So you can lower your arms. So these are the questions we would like to issue today, as our topic is identifying the misalignments in the transition to a sustainable road transportation system, and we have Gothenburg as a case study. And this is the kind of agenda today that we are following. So first I will start by giving a little bit background and giving the problem description. Then we will shortly go through the theory and method that we used in this study. And we will focus more on the results and analysis. And eventually we will also do some conclusions and give our insights about the scope for future research on this topic. And the problem or description, or where we started, is that currently the transportation system in Gothenburg, as in many of the medium or large-sized cities, is dependent on or based on a personal vehicle. And the problem with this is that there is only one person in one vehicle many times. These vehicles, like the transportation sector, accounts 34% of the carbon dioxide emissions in the region Western Sweden. And there is also, in addition to this, there is the particulate matter emissions. Of course, there is other externality. That's a hard word.
Yes.
Why did I wrote it there? There are also other problematic areas, such as noise. And when we have more cars, we have more emissions and more noise. And also, the topic of traffic safety is a concern in the transportation sector. So what we would like to have is a system which is more sustainable, so where the modes of active transportation, such as pedestrians and bicycles, would be more prioritized, as well as the public transportation. And with this, we could have fewer emissions and a safer and more efficient system. And there are European Union level plans, and also national and regional level plans to tackle these issues. But what we have concentrated on are the strategic documents of Gothenburg. And there are a lot of new innovations and business models going on in this field. So this is kind of a complex web of actors where many people have many conflicting visions and interests and ideas. And from this, we have come up with our research question. What are the current misalignments in the transition to a sustainable road transportation system in Gothenburg? And our main purpose in this thesis is to map and visualize these misalignments, so kind of show where there is a misalignment and also where there is agreement. Our secondary purpose is to inspect these effects and implications a little bit further and get more knowledge about these. And in order to find the misalignments in the system, we need to first visualize the system. So we treat the transportation system as a socio-technical system, which includes large numbers of different actors, and it's kind of puts the context further than just concentrating on the vehicle, for example. So there is things like regulations and policies involved. There is user practices. There is infrastructure in a fuel and road-wise, and also there is even the symbolic meaning of the vehicle. So we kind of this is our context for the transportation system. And what we have used is the multi-level perspective of GILs, where the regime is kind of the different aspects that you saw in the previous slide. And in this multi-level perspective, there is also other levels, such as landscape, which is then creating pressure to the regime in the form of environmental friendly policies and ideologies and like consumer behavior and so on. Then there is also niche level actors, which are kind of working with these kind of new innovations and business models and new solutions. And with the landscape creating a pressure to the regime, it makes the regime itself kind of unstable or able to change. And then these niche level actors can affect the regime and create something new.
Thank you, Ville. And now I will take over the little boring part, which is the method. And we based our entire research on this triangulation approach that we followed. So we have 3 different types of methods with a different kind of data output. And the idea to do that was to compare or answer the same research question using 3 different data types to ensure consistency. But our backbone are the semi-structured interviews, and I'll go into that a little more later. But we also have the Q methodology, which is a psychological tool that is used to assess subjectivity. And then, of course, we had like the old school workshop where we invited our interviewees and had like a discussion with them to dive deeper into some of the issues. So these are the organizations we interviewed, and as Ville pointed out, we tried to understand the system through the lens of the MLP perspective by GILs. So we, for example, have the city, the region, and the National Transport Administration representing the landscape. We have Volvo and DB Schenker representing the regime, and we have some new niche players like Einride and Ubigo representing the niche. And for those of you who were here this morning, John introduced the backcasting approach, and that's what we used in order to structure our interviews. So we asked interviewees to envision a desired future state of the transportation system that they would like to see, and then we asked them to reflect on the current state. And in the process, think about what are the strategies and solutions that would get them there. At the same time, think of the challenges that exist in the current system. After each interview, we asked the interviewees to perform the Q sort, where we basically had 23 statements from different goal documents that Ville mentioned. And the interviewees were asked to place these statements on this template, where they placed the 2 statements that they thought least described the state of the future transportation system over there, the ones they agreed with the most over here, and the neutral statements in the middle. And then we put it into software, magic happened, and we brought the results into the workshop, which was based on the World Cafe. And here we brought themes from the Q methodology, like the role of the personal car, or what should be done with public transportation. We divided our interviewees into subgroups, and then we sort of tried to dive deeper into these topics. And what did we find? So this is what the software gave us. These are the 11 participants, and this is their correlation with each other. And to simplify it, all the green that you see is actually alignment, that interviewees actually do agree with each other. And there's a lot of alignment in the system, which is a good thing. But then there's also misalignments, and there you see the red boxes. And I will try to explain both of these. So now I'll try to first explain the misalignments, and this is kind of like a really complicated part. So please stay with me. I'll try to make it interesting. So we divided our misalignments into clusters, and the first misalignment cluster has to do with the speed and nature of the transition itself. So if I start with long-term and short-term, there was a conflict in understanding what's going to happen in the system in the short term and what's going to happen in the long term. Some interviewees felt that in the short term, the increase in number of trips from the personal car is inevitable because it's important for economic growth, but not everybody agreed with that. When it came to autonomous vehicles, the misalignment was around the nature. Some interviewees felt that autonomous vehicles are the next thing. They're going to be integrated into the system quite well. They're going to fly in urban centers, whereas others disagreed and felt that no, they're only going to be visible in niche applications, for example, transporting passengers from aircrafts to the terminal. A similar concern was expressed around shared mobility, and a lot of interviewees questioned uh, the potential of shared mobility and its dependency on car ownership. And that if car ownership remains so strong in the region, the potential of shared mobility will remain untapped. Electrification was where there was a lot of agreement and everyone believed that it's the next big solution. However, there were some misalignments into when it will happen. Some interviewees believe that there's a lot of momentum gathering up and it's going to be the next big thing. Others believe that it will only be visible in large numbers in the system, 2050 and afterwards. And they brought up very familiar arguments as to why that would be the case because, well, we don't have enough clean electricity. There are going to be effects on the grid. And of course, the eternal question of who's going to provide the charging infrastructure, which brings me to the next cluster of misalignments, which has to do with roles of actors. So here we try to answer who does what or who should do what. And when it came to urban planning, it was who's going to provide the infrastructure. And some actors believe that it should be the industry, and some believe that it should be the policymakers, and the ball was passed around back and forth. And then we have customer ownership. It was unanimously agreed that in the future, the business model or the actor that is the closest to the customer is going to make the most money. And that's a misalignment because then all actors want to be close to the customer, but not everyone's going to do that. Which brings me to the aspect of collaboration versus competition. It was also unanimously agreed that we have to collaborate across different levels of the system in order to ensure that the transition happens smoothly. But how can we do that when we are in a market-based economy where business secrets are important? So how can those two sort of coexist? Another thing that was brought up in the interviews was that consumer behavior itself is kind of misunderstood, and that how people react to transportation solutions really needs to be understood a lot better. And then we have reactive versus proactive, where it was said that some actors perceive themselves to be proactive, that they lead the change, they test new solutions, whereas some other actors felt that not really, they are more reactive, they're seeing what's happening, waiting for change, and then adopting accordingly. And then there's investments, of course, and there was uncertainty about like also who's going to pay for the transition itself, because there's a lot of money involved. And of course, that leads me to the next cluster of misalignments, which has to do with planning for projects. And investments has directly to do with how organizations work. Some actors work on a prognosis-based approach, which means that they say, okay, this is what's happened in the past, this is what's happening now, where the problems are, this is what's going to happen in the future, and so they invest their budget, invest their money there. Whereas some are more visionary, and they're like, no, this is where we want to go, this is what we want to do in the future, and that's where we're going to invest. So there's an obvious conflict, which also reflects on investments, and is also in a sense connected to long-term versus short-term. Some interviewees felt that if you look at the short term, obviously the economic goals and environmental goals are conflicting each other. On the other hand, if you look at the long term, then technologies will be so good that the environmental effects will be mitigated for. And so that's all right. Right now, the focus should be the economy. But again, not everybody agreed about that. Continuing the economy versus environment thread, it was pointed out that for especially the regime level actors, so the companies, it's very difficult to push sustainable choices out there because they're very, very costly and there's no cost sharing happening. And so the most sustainable choice is not the most economically viable. Another interesting thing that was brought up as a misalignment was that like in the system, there's a very narrow window of opportunity in the sense that there's only a limited time in the system when a technology can sort of be absorbed by all the actors. But then the problem is not everybody in the system visualizes that the window is open, and then it's lost. And that was pointed out as a misalignment as well. Again, to do with collaboration, it was said that, well, we have to collaborate, and we have to collaborate early in order to save money. But then, because of all of these misalignments and more to come, it's difficult. If you bring everybody onto the table in the beginning, then the project is going to be delayed. So it was also pointed out as a misalignment, which takes me to probably the most important misalignment cluster, which is around modes of transportation itself. Let me begin with the role of the personal car. It was pointed out that Gothenburg is an American city in the sense that it's very widespread, the neighborhoods are far apart. The role of the car is really, really strong. Very hard to fight with because of last mile connectivity. That's always going to be a problem. But then the city has densification plans. And what will be the role of the personal car in this density remains an important question. It was also pointed out that there are plans by actors to make the system bad for cars, but they are not complemented by making other modes of transportation strong. And let me take you to public transportation because that has directly to do with it. It was pointed out that it is more like a social service. It's something that the region has to provide. And therefore, if they provide last mile connectivity through public transportation, it's not going to make any sense because it's not profitable already. And that brings us to MaaS, mobility as a service, which was seen as a big misalignment because some actors didn't believe in its potential at all. And the reason they gave was that mobility as a service takes different modes of transportation that are already inefficient, packages them into one package, and then tries to sell it. And who's going to buy that? And that's not, it was pointed out that that's not a robust business model. And then again, this misalignment is sort of connected to collaboration versus competition. Some actors believe that MaaS could actually complement the public transportation and sort of solve the last mile problem that exists in the public transportation. And so there would be collaboration. But others pointed out that with MaaS actors emerging, nobody would want to use public transportation anymore, and that there would be competition, and that MaaS would outcompete. And then there's active mobility, which is linked to consumer behavior, and this was brought up mostly in the workshop, and it was pointed out that urban planners don't even see active mobility as a mode of transportation. They only see it as limited in short areas of the city, and that has to do with because they don't really understand how consumers use a bike, so they don't see its complete potential. And then finally, there's that misalignment which kind of looms over the system, and that has to do with uncertainty. So tech solutions, there are too many tech solutions at the moment, and that is problematic. Why? Well, for the regime players, it's problematic because they are basically all over the map, and that also has to do with organizational sprawl. It was pointed out that the regime players have very limited resources. If they put it in electrification and gas and a lot of different technologies, it's not a very pragmatic approach. And for the niche players, it's obviously a problem because nobody sees the value in their business models because there's so many out there, so they don't get any investments. And finally, there's the classic debate of tech neutrality, which means that should policy makers favor a particular technology, and opinions were divided. Some people believed, of course, yes, they should favor one particular technology, make all this, enable all the systems so that it is absorbed quickly by the system. But some others believe that no, and now I'm going to use Ville's favorite word, policymakers should just penalize externalities and not really favor a technology. They should remain neutral, and that should be the role of the market. Poof. And now, conclusions. So since there were so many misalignments and so many terms thrown around, we tried to differentiate between the misalignments as strategic and systemic. Now, let me remind you that the line between the two of them is not always very clear. However, strategic misalignments simply exist between two or more actors in the system, so they basically disagree. Systemic misalignments are the abstract, intangible misalignments that are part of the system itself. Well, that's how we classify them. Now, if we go into the reasons, then the strategic misalignments exist, as Ville said earlier, because it's a complex set of actors and they have different visions and goals. So obviously they're bound to exist. Systemic misalignments exist because the transportation system has been dependent on fossil fuels for a very, very long time, and therefore there's an incentive to stay locked in the carbon mechanism that exists. What are the effects of misalignments? Well, because of strategic misalignments, there's just competition in the system. It's part of the natural market economic system, and there are limited market segments. So for example, if we take low carbon transportation, obviously gas and electric and hydrogen are competing with each other. So that's just bound to exist. Systemic misalignments, on the other hand, like I mentioned earlier, because they provide incentives to stay in the current system, actually are hindering the transition. And since they're so intangible, they're also difficult to remove. Which brings us to what would happen if you try to mitigate misalignments. We conclude that with strategic misalignments, it is valuable to remove them if value creation is possible. So if the actors can see that there's some value possible for both through collaboration, then they should work towards to remove it. Whereas systemic misalignments, there should be a lot more efforts, a lot more focus on that because they affect all actors in the system. And therefore, supportive policies are very, very important for that, and also because they prevent fragmentation.
Oh, yeah. Andreas, there is some update coming on your computer. So.
Oh, then you have to click it so you can update. No.
Okay, as promised, there was a lot of green in that correlation matrix. There is some common ground as well, and not just misalignments. I'm going to quickly take you through that. So firstly, the good thing is that everybody agreed on the values for the future transportation system. Everybody believed it should be accessible, it should be safe, it should be low emissions, and it should be very, very highly efficient in transporting people from A to B. The future of the transportation system was anticipated to be connected, and in that sense, obviously it was pointed out that we need to together decide what type of data we share with each other and in what format so that it's standardized. And how do we do this? It was also agreed that we need very strong legislation. So we need laws that dictate what kind of data is shared and how also personal privacy is maintained in order to prevent totalitarianism in a sense that one authority is controlling all the data. And again, collaboration platforms were seen as something very, very important, something also very unique to Sweden in a sense, and that they're very, very important where the transition will go forward together. So in that sense, they have the ball where the change will happen. And policies, again, once again, were seen as very, very important because they set the right vectors and principles so that all actors can follow that. And since we focused on Gothenburg, the role of urban planners was obviously very important. So for example, especially in mitigating what would happen if there's a lot of self-driving vehicles in the system. And if that leads to congestion, then whose responsibility is it? And then everybody agreed that it should be the urban planners who should anticipate that and plan for that.
Okay, thank you, Nickhil. Now it's time for breathe for you. Do you need any water?
No, I'm good.
Okay, so from these previous misalignments and results, we kind of we come up with a series of or set of how and who questions to kind of summarize and also act as a scope for the future research. So first of all, there is the question how to allocate or prioritize the urban space, and this comes from the fact that the road space is limited in the city, and it was agreed that the public transportation should be prioritized, but there was a question if that should be at the expense of the personal vehicle or not. So that we think that is one question that should be raised up. Also, as Nickhil mentioned on the misalignments with modes of transportation, the potential of active modes of transportation is something that should be issued in this question. Like, should there be for bikes separate lanes or like more space allocated in the system? We had also questions of how should the data be shared, as it was brought up in the common ground, but as well in the misalignments. So there is a lot of conflict about the personal integrity versus system efficiency. Like the system would be more maybe efficient if more information is shared, but can everything be shared? And also the question of how the data should be valued. Like again, there is a question of with system efficiency and competitive edge of the companies, because this data that they gather and produce is valuable for the companies. So how should that data be valued? That could, if there is a framework steering that kind of discussion, then it would accelerate the transition. And the standardization and framework were also recognized for within the interviewees that they would be the enablers of this to make this acceleration to happen. And then we also wanted to raise a question like how should the data be included in the business models? Like should the companies, how should they see the data there? Then we also had a question of how should mobility as a service kind of solutions be embedded with the public transportation. And this comes with the misalignment cluster of modes of transportation as Nickhil presented. And it is because like if the in the future transportation system, is the business model of public transportation, is it viable as it is now? Or should it be complemented with the mobility as a service kind of solutions? Or will these solutions compete with the public transportation? So this is kind of a question what was brought up with in this topic, which leads to the who owns the customer question. Who is supplier for who? I mean, it was like many of the interviewees wanted to stay close to the customer because they saw that there is most of the value for the organizations. And this came up also with the car manufacturers and mobility operators. Like, for example, there is now it looks that they are forming some kind of partnership deals rather than competing. Like there is a lot of news that some Swedish car manufacturers are also making partnerships with ride-hailing companies and so on. So, but there is still a question like in the future, who is supplier for who? Will these car manufacturers just supply their cars to the mobility operators who actually own the customer? And this is kind of, we found out that it's creating kind of conflicts within the actors. We also had question, who should buy down the cost of these new innovations and solutions, as it was brought up in the misalignment cluster about roles, as Nickhil did earlier, before. So, but we found out that it's rather difficult to ask who should do this, because it is kind of a complex net of or web of different actors. So, the first investments were seen kind of risky because you don't know what is the market demand in the future, or if there are favoring policies in the future anymore. Like if there are now, will they be there in the future? So single actors found it very, very hard to, or risky to take these first investments. And this connects also to the economic driver, as was mentioned in the presentation before the lunch break, that the economic driver is strong, and the sustainable choices should also offer some economic value. So the question is how to ensure that there is value in the value chain to all of these actors. And again, legislations and restrictions were believed to guide these actions towards the right direction. So it kind of, in our interviews, it put quite a lot of pressure for the policymakers to make favoring policies. So then we would like to finally point out some areas where we think that there is momentum where different actors should concentrate on. And there is the how perspective. As I mentioned, it is rather difficult to ask things from the who questions. So it would be more beneficial to ask how questions. And this is because of the responsibilities of the single actors. As I mentioned, it is difficult to place strong responsibilities for single actor in this socio-technical system. And they are they might not be willing to take them. Then there was the topic about market demand and supporting policies. It was believed that these two things have a very strong role, either to hinder or accelerate the transition. And the economic viability of the solution was yet again brought up, which connects to the last point, the economic viability and value chain. As I mentioned in the theory earlier, there is these niche level actors coming up with new kind of solutions. For example, these mobility subscription packages, which you would then buy rather than buying a car, maybe in the future. So how to ensure that their value is divided evenly, or not evenly, but that there is value in all the actors in the value chain. That there is all of a sudden there is not one link which is needed kind of the system, but there is they are not getting or that there is no money coming in that direction anymore. So these are kind of the 4 points that we wanted to point out. So with this, we would like to actually conclude our presentation, and we'd like to thank you for your attention, and we are open for further questions about the topic.
So, first, let's move into the opposition. So, Ville, welcome to the stage. Now you've got 10 minutes to ask a lot of questions, and then after that, it's open for the audience.
Will do. Thank you, Andreas. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this presentation and the report. Super interesting topic from my point of view. Mobility is so important for the development in general. Much more mobility, sustainability aspects, all that kind of stuff in very short, a lot of information in a very short time. So thank you for that. Since it is such a complex topic, we really liked how you used the Q methodology to get some hard numbers, so to say, in this qualitative research that can be sometimes, at least for us as engineers, quite vague. We do, however, have some questions, and Johanna is going to take over for the first one.
The first one is, who do you actually address your thesis to, or who do you think would benefit from knowing this misalignment, and how would that kind of ease the situation?
It's we have asked that question a lot for ourselves as well. No, but we think that it could be like that, just or as we talked with our supervisor, like just mapping the system is kind of beneficial, like for all the actors who are part of it. Like policymakers could use it somehow to steer or like see that what is maybe expected from them, and also like then again like private companies could could see the kind of where the misalignments be and then act accordingly. So you know that they, like many of these might be quite obvious, but then if it's you have them mapped out, then you can kind of plan for your actions and like that take those in consideration when you are like in your business model, for example, and what is expected, if it's expected to change during the transition process.
Yeah, we're going to present the same thing at Trafikverket, and they're interested just to like Ville said, just to see where the misalignments are.
Okay, and you focus a lot on misalignments between all the companies in general towards the future. Did you also look a little bit at what we did in phase 1, these principles for a desirable sustainable future, and looked at where are misalignments between all those strategies and what we came up with in the first phase?
You mean our sustainability principles?
Exactly.
I don't think we
Or how the vision of the future that we kind of saw in our group, is it kind of similar to the vision that the stakeholders had?
It's very interesting.
I mean,
did you see any big differences?
There were kind of similar words, and but then in the interviews, what was maybe problematic was when we asked to describe the future transportation system, there was like this only words popping up. So like it's highly efficient. So then in the interviews we tried to dig deep, like okay, what is the meaning of efficient for you, and then compare like if that efficiency is something different for the other actors. But like the values, kind of they were, I think the values itself, as Nickhil showed in the common ground slides, they are quite much aligned with what we came up in the phase 1 report here at the Challenge Lab during the winter months.
Then it is quite complicated because in the transportation system, like that's also what I was reflecting about from the earlier presentations with Georgia and Linnea and also Krishna and Pia. There you have the social aspect, which is very sort of important and strong, whereas in the transportation system, or at least I thought that it would be not that strong. It would be more the economy because of the direct link, but it was actually also coming up quite often.
And if I can continue from that, well, like the research of John was mentioned in some of the interviews that benefits of having better public transportation system is harder to place or like to make it them concrete numbers, as it is like freight transportation. You get more food flowing. It's easy to say that this is valuable in that sense. But the aspects of like having less congestion and less noise and safer system, and that's something that Pia and Kresnik also mentioned. Like it's hard to put a like concrete value on that. Only like number that. So that is one of the.
Thank you. The next question is about one of your clusters that you had, which is the.
To go back?
You can, yeah. So you had one cluster which was the uncertainty cluster.
Yes.
And which was.
Sorry,
no worries.
There's more. Oh, there we go.
Yes, in the upper left corner, right?
Yes.
The uncertainty.
Yes.
And we were wondering why is that detached from everything else? Because it feels like there is a lot of uncertainty in all of those sorta. What modes will there be? How are they all connected? So we were just wondering why this uncertainty cluster is the only one that is detached, even though it feels it is sort of connected to all of them.
Yeah, I mean maybe that's as I made the picture, maybe that's like a little bit like a design fault. It could be also like an overarching theme, so it could be a bubble around it.
Yeah, think of it as like a sun shining upon all of these misalignments.
That's what we had in mind when we did it. Isn't that clear?
Okay, so it is as a matter of fact.
Yeah, it's connected to very much.
Okay.
And here we try to only like you could technically make almost every spoke connected, but we try to keep it like only the very concrete and clear connections that showed up visualized here in this.
And question answered. Perfect.
Our next question is about the who and the how question.
Yeah.
This part was really interesting to read, and it was like nice having actually these questions. But it's like who came up with this question? Was it the two of you, or did they come up like in some interview or during the workshop? And who do you want to answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were like kind of popping out while we were struggling through the results, which were many statements. And then when we were writing those down, those questions started to pop up, and we made a kind of comment in our working file. And then at the end, we were starting to check them out, and we saw that there is connections, and then we kind of grouped up. So they were kind of questions that we asked during when going through the results.
Yeah, and I think the who question really comes up really often because the actors also really diplomatic when they answer, and they're like, yeah, but we can't pay for this. And so when we were going through, we were like, okay, but then who's going to, because nobody wants to pay for it. So that's how we came up with this question.
And therefore we came up to the conclusion that because the who questions are a lot of pointing at fingers, and it kind of felt it going in circles, so maybe rather ask how.
How should we do it? And then by answering how, you can lead to who should do it.
That was actually a little somewhat of a follow-up question, because in the conclusion you kind of say really quick that the who question should be rather how questions.
Yeah.
And we were wondering, why is that? Wouldn't it be good to kind of find out who is part of this responsibility, or who is in charge?
Yeah, that's kind of conflicting in some of the theories that we had in Challenge Lab. Like, for example, who owns the problem, that was part of the phase 1 report. But then we, when we wrote down those who questions, there was a lot of sub-questions which started with how. So then we figured out, okay, that the who question can be asked with many of kind of how questions. So then we found out, or we concluded that might be beneficial to try that approach, because it looked like finding the one single actor that who should do something, it was rather complex. But maybe it could be the process of how to do something, and that is actually happening in the collaboration platforms. That is gathering Drive Sweden, that is gathering a lot of people, and there they actually are putting a little bit okay, who is doing what, but the process itself is how to do something first before saying who's do what.
So it's sort of supplementary to work towards the
Absolutely, absolutely. Because right now, for example, in Drive Sweden, they're doing a lot of research on how should autonomous vehicles look like, and there's a lot, Ville says, how to do it, and then that would automatically lead you to, okay, who has the strengths to do this, and then that person automatically does it, but then it's being answered in a collaborative fashion.
You've got 2 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
While talking about different actors, do you think that you missed out on someone's voice for this whole process?
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the obvious people we missed out was Vastrafik, because they are the ones providing the public transportation, which was brought up often. Even though we interviewed the region which sort of owns Vastrafik, we didn't really interview public transportation. So from my perspective, that was one voice that was sort of missing.
Yeah, and but then there was for sure some actors missing, but we tried to follow the multi-level perspective to have interviewees on each section, and we eventually we ended up to 12, which was I think quite a maximum number of interviewees that we can have in this study. So of course that is a big limitation that not all the voices are heard.
Absolutely.
We were wondering, you said at some point, obviously there is some sort of subjectivity to the interviews when they present their statements or when they discuss statements with you. And we were just wondering, to which extent did you look at what interviews said in comparison to what the interviews company has announced or has strategic papers for in towards that direction? So did they actually represent whatever strategy their company had? Or
I would say yes.
Yeah, I mean, there was like we read the kind of sustainability reports of the organizations before doing the interviews, but we didn't like directly compare those two together. But
they were quite consistent because they often were actually quite explicitly stating this is what we do and not really making I statements. So it was mostly consistent. But we didn't really sort of go back and check. But what we tried to do was sort of do like internal checks comparing with the Q methodology. Like what did they say in the Q methodology? Is it because the Q methodology was more personal because they didn't have to explain why they're placing something where. So if they place the potential of public transportation as, I'm not sure about this, then we try to see if that's also what they said in the interview. So that's how we compared it, but not really with the.
Thank you so much for your answers. Once again, thank you so much, and a big compliment to what you have achieved. It's such a complex issue, the development of the city. So I don't know how, maybe it's even too large for a PhD. I don't know. This is really, really big. So congrats.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
the work conducted.
So, thank you very much. Let's open up for questions from the audience. Whoever wants to go first can direct the question to you. I see that John has a question.
You mentioned trafikverket, but you didn't mention the traffic office in the city. Were you in contact with them also?
Yes. You mean Traffic Control? Yes, we did 2 interviews with them actually. So we were quite often in touch with them, and they were also part of the workshop as well. So we had the Traffic Control, and then we had the region, and then we had Trafikverket as well.
Yeah. Did they say anything about the usefulness of this study?
I think they had a similar opinion, like they didn't want to be very involved in it, but they did see value in it. They said that it would be interesting for them to see where are the misalignments in the system, because they're also interacting with many actors, and sometimes it's not like they mentioned that they don't see it themselves, but it probably does exist. So they did see some value in that sense, but not like in a very direct way.
But they would be in the center of being interested in this study, actually.
And they are the ones that we recognize as the main stakeholder during the phase 1 of Challenge Lab to kind of build it.
But I also know that they are very stressed. So stressed that they are not able to get an overview. That is often the situation.
Yeah, we will for sure send our summary of findings to our contact person there.
Maybe contact them again.
Yeah, exactly. Good.
Gunilla, you had a comment or a question?
Yes, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I'm working with public affairs at the West Sweden Chamber of Commerce, and we've got nearly 3,000 members, and many of them have problems with exactly this, and especially when it comes to traffic and the between Trafikverket and Trafikkontoret. These two levels don't speak very well with each other. From the municipality, they always talk in sort of visionary terms, and Trafikverket on the national level says we have our prognosis, and that's what we sort of deal with. So how can we make these meet and talk from a sort of common ground? Do you have any sort of solutions in your back pocket after this?
That's an excellent question. And I don't know if we came up with any proposals or solutions for that. We kind of mapped out that there is the problem with the exactly prognosis versus visionary plans. But then what we have here is the connection to the investments, for example. That it that was our connection point. That because if you had the prognosis-based way of working, then you kind of do the investments accordingly, and then visionary, then the investors would be somewhere else. So maybe that would be one approach to talk about money, as many times where things.
And in fact, it was also brought up at the interview with Trafikverket. They said that they often do, or at least not here in Gothenburg, but in other parts of Sweden, they do actually provide incentives for municipalities if they see a win-win situation. So I guess this is completely my personal opinion, I feel like they don't see that here, and they see more that their highways are being damaged, and that's something they hold very dear, and that they don't want to collaborate, or they see that spat sort of coming. And that's why I think like if they can invest in a project where they both have sort of win-win situation, and also if the National Traffic Administration is involved in Drive Sweden, because that's where all of these actors come together and a lot of things are happening. And there, for example, we spoke with Einride, who said that they have support from both Trafikkontoret and the region and Trafikverket. So these platforms where they talk around issues they all care about. Maybe that's a starting point.
And if I can just add one more thing, that there was also the point taken up that actually like the plans for have a dense city, and when you build close to highways, that creates more traffic according to Trafikverket. So they need to react to that. So that was kind of one conflict within the system, that the city wants to build and become more dense, but once you build closer to the roads, you will create more traffic, and then they need to react to that. And that was kind of a systematic misalignment in the system that should be addressed maybe in Challenge Lab thesis 2019.
Yeah, we need more research in that.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important question, and we've been critical about that as well, like our approach. And I think it all started here with the conflict between the city and the National Traffic Administration, where we sort of did the whole system. So maybe focusing on them would be more interesting, to see more the nitty-gritties and see where the misalignments are, and then looking for possibilities of common ground. That could be more useful in that sense.
You have to continue.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah.
First, I would like to say thank you for a really interesting and good presentation. It was very easy to follow. But I'm curious about what happens when you go into an organization with the aim of looking for misalignments. How was it perceived by the people you spoke to? What happened?
Very interesting question.
Well, like the misalignments in the transportation system or misalignments in the organization? What did you mean system?
Yeah, what you asked for when you said what are the misalignments?
I think people were kind of open and said like this is like a topic that it's good to be addressed, and everyone kind of had to believe that there are misalignments in the system. So they were very kind of interested about having these interviews, and it was, I think it's good.
But I think that also brings me to a very important aspect of our method itself. And we were kind of freaked out that we just structured our interviews on the backcasting approach and didn't really focus that much on misalignments, or didn't define what a misalignment was. But that turned out to be good, or at least I would say so, because when we asked for misalignments, they also pointed out the systemic misalignments. And had we already told them, like, do you see actors where you have misalignments, they probably would have stuck to just actor-based misalignments. But when we asked for misalignments very broadly, they interpreted it and they defined misalignments even in the system. Like, for example, economy and environment not going together, and saying that that's a very difficult thing. But in general, yes, they were quite open. And sometimes they even said that there are no misalignments. But then they continued, of course, and pointed out 5 or 6.
Johan had a comment, question as well.
Yeah, and from your own perspective, now you had a nice presentation from beginning to end, and it also looked linear, and you said the method was the boring part of the work, but also like an important part in order to create some structure in this complex area. But can you give us some feeling what it was like going about to do the research? Were you challenged?
Yeah, definitely. I think everything we found a really interesting meme on Facebook that described our thesis. So it had like this horse that was beautifully drawn and shaded, and it had like really nice calf muscles. So that was when we were like doing backcasting. We were like, yes, misalignments, we're going to be awesome at this. And then by the time we came to the head of the horse, it looked like a giraffe. So it really taught us a lot of valuable lessons about research and how it's very important to be like focused on what do you really, really want to see. Otherwise, you risk going all over the place. But I think we did manage to sort of bring it back. And I really want to thank Francis for that. And also Gavin, who's probably looking at this in a bus somewhere. I don't know where, but really, with their help, we could actually sort of, put it all
Make
together.
sense of all of the data that we had.
Yeah.
But it was challenging for sure.
Definitely.
First comment is that I think this is the cleanest presentation I've ever seen. So this is no disrespect to any other, but I just thought it really well. I was just curious. It's probably not such a deep question, but I saw. Can you bring back the table of agreements? And,
Yes.
I got it.
Oh.
It's the other way around.
Oh.
No,
it's the correlation matrix. I think.
Oh, that one. Okay.
Yes. Because I saw something interesting there. Can you just
Ville, it's the correlation matrix.
Yeah.
The next one. Yeah.
Found it.
I see. I wanted to know participant number 5.
Yeah. Who is that? Exactly.
What's the problem?
Don't say that. I'm afraid we are very, very ethical researchers, and we're not allowed to reveal anything about the identity of our participants.
But did you follow up maybe with this participant? Does this participant have an important role?
Absolutely, and I think that's where we were really convinced that it's a good thing to use Q methodology, because when we were in the interview, we were both flabbergasted because we were like, wow, this is everything against everything that everyone has said. And then when we found the results of the Q methodology, it actually did make sense. Like, that person does disagree with everyone. So it was true. Like, they do.
Will you reflect back on this with the person? Will you give the person feedback?
That's a good point. Actually.
I guess if the person is of an important role, then this person.
Yeah, I think we were planning to send out some kind of executive summary of the thesis for the interviewees, and then that's something we haven't decided. Like, should we how clearly we should point out this, but of course we will send this, and maybe persons who are part of will recognize where they are when they check it.
Probably.
But that's something that we need to discuss, and it's a good point to bring up.
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely. That's a very good point. Thank you for that.
Because if nothing else, I think this would be very valuable for that person.
Yeah. Or they would completely disregard our thesis.
They disagree with your.
Yeah, you're wrong. Yeah, but yeah, it's a really good something to think about for sure. Yeah.
Any more questions? So you said that you're going to meet Trafikverket as well to present your thesis in a couple of weeks? Or
No, not in the fall.
In the fall?
Yeah.
So they're interested in looking into this more again. Gunilla, the Chamber of Commerce, are you interested in hearing more? I'm just throwing...
Might be, yeah. We have a workshop actually on... We recently released a report on why the planning process is so so hard to get going here in Gothenburg, and we found that between the Trafikverket and Trafikkontoret there is something very special going on, or not going on. So we will have a workshop where all these different stakeholders will come, and you think about it, but it might be a good thing to have something from you as well. So maybe we can just keep in touch.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting to connect to what you said, Ville, as well. The aspect when you're building close to the road, the highway, and that you're going to get more cars on that road. It's basically what you were discussing a couple of weeks ago. And,
exactly. Gothenburg is really in Sweden. It's there's so many överklaganden, vad heter det?
Appeals.
Appeals from the national level on, especially on traffic, and that they say we can't build here because it's going to generate too much traffic. And during the last 4 years, in Gothenburg, there's been 15 such appeals. In Stockholm, 10, and Stockholm are building much more, and in Malmö too. So it's Gothenburg is a special city.
Yeah, Andreas did pass us the article about that. Yeah.
But let's keep in touch.
Yeah, and if you're interested in actually reading what people said, we put up some posters there around misalignments if you want to read them over coffee.
Nice.
Yeah, thank you.
And that was a really good way of saying now it's time for coffee. Thank you very much. So around the corner there's coffee and cake, and in 15 minutes we will start with the final presentation of